move this too because I'm OCD.
Shall we to introduce?
You don't have to. Do you guys know who I am? No, this happens. My name's Ken Gerhard. Welcome everyone for coming out. And I think we should have a round of applause for our previous three speakers. I think they were really outstanding presentations. And on a personal note, I'd like to say it's really cool for me to see this rock and roll vibe happening in the field of cryptozoology. I don't know if you guys are picking up on that or not, but you have some kind of outside the box people here that are doing these particular presentations and this kind of research. Anyways, what I'm going to be talking about today is my new book, which is called Encounters with Flying Humanoids. It's going to be released this year by Llewellyn Publishing. And you know, essentially this is going to be dealing with, as you might imagine, things like the Mothman and different types of flying creatures, particularly flying creatures that are humanoid in nature. And I was going to kind of start out with this kind of grandiose thing about, you know, since the dawn of mankind, we've been looking up at the skies and dreaming about flight and all that. But that's in the book anyways. But this is kind of like a fringe area of cryptozoology, as you might imagine. You know, as was Nick's lecture to a great extent, you know, cryptozoology, of course, is based in the foundations of, you know, traditional zoology and science, and it should be based on flesh and blood. At least that's how the founding fathers, people like Bernard Heuvelmans and so forth, envisioned it. But it is a constantly evolving field, and so we've it's kind of evolved and changed now so that it encompasses things that are a little bit more, you know, out there in terms of plausibility. But nonetheless, there are reports and, you know, things that we do investigate as cryptozoologists. And I guess because of the bestial nature of some of these different types of creatures, that's kind of why we work on these topics that are considered, I guess, more along the lines of Fortean phenomenon or zooform phenomenon, as it's often called. I'll try to move along quickly because we have an abbreviated schedule and I have a lot of slides. But basically, I just wanted to point out that the notion of, well, let's say, the conceptual synthesis of human and avian characteristics dates back at least 17,000 years. At least according to carbon dating, that's what this particular figure known as the Birdman of Lascaux, the famous Lascaux caves in France, where, you know, basically hundreds of these images painted on the cave walls. And this particular image is a man-like figure with a bird's head, and he's falling, and, you know, I know this is probably a PG-rated thing, so I'm not going to, but you can kind of see he's falling in front of this bison. There's many different interpretations of this. Perhaps it's a shamanistic thing, or, you know, something spiritual in nature. But it basically just illustrates a point that, you know, tens of thousands of years ago, humans were already beginning to blend human characteristics with those of birds. And then about 900 BC, we had the Sumerians worshipped certain types of demigods known as the Apkallu or the Abgal. And you can find these in different bas-reliefs of this time. They were typically portrayed as either you know, man-like figures with a bird's head, or sometimes long-bearded men with, you know, wings or different other animal characteristics. So these were anthropomorphic beings, essentially blending human and animal characteristics. And they were viewed as demigods, sages, protectors. Their images often adorned sort of sacred places. So they were, you know, essentially worshipped. You probably also heard of the, you know, the Anunnaki, which is kind of a similar type of being that, you know, if you're into the whole ancient aliens thing, it's kind of all ties into that. And then for those of you who are fans of The Exorcist, we have Pazuzu, or Zu, which is an Assyrian deity. And Pazuzu was basically the king of the wind demons, I should say. And he was usually depicted as having a human-like body with a dog's head, 4 attached wings, talons, and he typically had his right hand raised. And Pazuzu was essentially viewed as a harbinger of a bringer of destruction and inclement weather and disaster. So, you know, this is kind of our first clue that these flying humanoid type beings were essentially viewed as bad omens, or, you know, essentially harbingers of very bad events. Thanks, Nick. In Hindu and Buddhist culture, we have the Garuda. And Garuda is again sort of viewed as kind of a messenger or an omen. Garuda is typically portrayed as a gigantic bird and said to have mile-long wings. But on the other hand, often displayed with human-like characteristics, like human-like form and head, golden feathers. The Garuda is, again, it's a very prevalent thing in that particular culture. Those of you that have read the works of John Keel and Andy Colvin and other people that have written about Mothman, they often refer to the Mothman as a form of a Garuda. And in fact, I think the national airline in Thailand is actually called Garuda Airlines. So it's a, it's a very prevalent theory in their culture. And then here in the Americas, we have similar types of beings. For example, this is Camazotz, or Zotz, also called the death bat. This is again a winged deity, mixing the characteristics of a man and a bat, often sacrificed with bloodshed and sacrifice. Is said to abduct women and small children. Was accused of murdering a very famous Maya folk hero, and I believe the Zapotec and the Maya both worshipped the Camazotz. This particular bas relief here was actually found on some ruins down in Honduras, the ruins of Copan. In Japan, in Japanese folklore, we have the Tengu, which is essentially a mischievous forest spirit, sometimes very dangerous, oftentimes playful. Different types of Tengu, but again, typically a man-like form, portrayed with wings and sometimes a beak or a very long nose that's shaped like a beak. And I'm just trying to illustrate here that this is a cross-cultural phenomenon. You have all these different diverse cultures and mythologies all over the world where these winged deities or human-like winged beings pop up. Now, the belief in angels, of course, we all know that angels are viewed as essentially the ambassadors from God, messengers and so forth. The notion of winged angels is actually kind of a misperception, because that was something that kind of evolved in medieval art and the Renaissance period as artists like Da Vinci began to paint and interpret them. There are very few references in the Bible to winged angels, although if you recall the very famous incident with Ezekiel and the Merkabah, the fiery chariot that shot through the sky, he actually described 4 beings known as the Kayot that were essentially winged beings that had 4 faces. Greek mythology, of course, the Harpies, and oftentimes the Sirens. They were portrayed as swarthy, hideous, hag-like female figures with the head of a woman and breasts and a feathered bird-like body, sharp talons, supposedly a very rancid smell. Just very nasty beings or creatures. Got it, Nick. The Alkonost, this is from Russian and Slavic mythology, and the Alkonost is essentially similar to the harpy, but described as a very beautiful woman with a bird's body. And it is said that that she has a beautiful, mournful singing voice, and that all that hear her sing are basically entranced in her spell. So very similar to the Greek siren legend. And then we get into sort of these anthropomorphic, bat people, bat-winged creatures. This is not a mythology or folklore, but rather sort of this is from something called the Great Moon Hoax, which was a series of newspaper articles in the 19th century that duped the public into believing that there was a race of bat-winged creatures living on the moon, and it was quickly revealed to be a hoax. But we do have certain types of beings, bat-man hybrid type creatures. For example, in Mexico, from the Chiapas region of Mexico, we have the Tzeltal Indians believed in something known as the Icals. And the Icals were described as small, hairy, hair-covered black men that lived in caves and had bat-like wings. And they were very feared because it was believed that they would come down and abduct women and small children. And I was very fortunate for my book to have Dr. Carl Schuker. He's actually written the foreword for my book. And Schuker here has written about the orang bati, or man bat, from the Isle of Seram in Indonesia. Am I standing in the way or like blocking these? I'm sorry, guys. I don't know. Nick, what's the best way? Should I get to the wall here?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the orang bati, or man bat, from Malaccan folklore, the Isle of Seram is basically a man bat type creature that swoops down from the mountains at night and abducts small children and women. And we also have one known as the papabawa from the African Isle of Pemba, which again is said to basically be a very nasty humanoid creature with bat-like wings that swoops down and attacks children and women, and is, you know, so again, we have these recurring themes in different mythologies and folklores, and they're typically viewed as, you know, very unpleasant types of beings. Things that you don't want to run across. Now, I did broaden the scope of the book just because I wanted to kind of cover some different other subjects, and one of the things that I wrote about was Spring-heeled Jack. Spring-heeled Jack, of course, is not a flying humanoid in the traditional sense, but sort of, I guess, what you would color as either an urban legend or a, you know, a supervillain. And stories of Spring-heeled Jack began to appear in British newspapers back in the year 1734. And Spring-heeled Jack was essentially, though not winged, it was alleged that he could spring or jump incredible distances, basically in defiance of gravity. And he was described by many of his attackers as being very tall and thin, wearing a helmet, a cape, steely claws that would rip at your clothes and skin, glowing red eyes, and this is one of the first times we hear about the famous glowing eyes, which are often associated with, as Nick mentioned, different types of sort of paranormal Bigfoot type cases and things. What's really interesting is that Spring-heeled Jack was said to have vomited blue flames into the faces of his victims. So kind of a very nasty person you wouldn't want to run across. What's interesting is that there's actually a report of a Spring-heeled Jack-like character as recently as February of this past year in southern England. So. And of course the Jersey Devil, and people always want to ask me about the Jersey Devil. I do have a chapter in the book about sort of gargoyle types of creatures or chimera-like creatures. The Jersey Devil is very famous, of course, American urban legend from an area of southern New Jersey known as the Pine Barrens, which is about 22,000 acres, just very wooded, remote area. The Jersey Devil is typically described as about 3 to 5 feet tall, with a dog-like muzzle attached to a horse-like head, a long neck, a kangaroo-like body, of course bat-like wings, hoofs, and kind of a long reptilian tail. And the famous legend is that, of course, this woman named Mrs. Leeds back in the 18th century had 12 children, and you know, she found out she was pregnant with her 13th child, and she cursed it and uttered an imprecation, and then this devil was born and flew out the window and still lives in the Pine Barrens to this day. The most famous series of Jersey Devil sightings occurred in the year 1909, and there was like a little period of mass hysteria in January of 1909 where newspapers throughout New Jersey and Pennsylvania had these reports of people encountering the Jersey Devil. Again, generally described as, or generally believed to be just basically a bad omen, something you don't want to come across. I do have one particular case that I write about in the book of a gentleman who claims he saw the Jersey Devil back in the year 1988, and I've interviewed this gentleman several times, and he seems very credible, and what he described it as looking like is basically a flying monkey. He said it ran across the road in front of his car. There was no mistaking what he saw. It was on 4 legs, but it had a monkey-like face, bat-like wings, and a long tail. So who knows? Maybe there is something to it. I also do a chapter in the book on sort of cases that seem to have more links or connections to UFO activity. And again, these are not traditionally flying humanoids, but they are, perhaps some way related to the phenomenon. Who knows? So, for example, one famous case involves the Flatwoods Monster, or the Beast of Braxton County. There was a very famous case in the year 1952 in a remote area of West Virginia known as Flatwoods, where several people watched this glowing orange ball descend from the sky, and when they hiked up a hill to see what it was, they encountered this humanoid creature that stood about 9 feet tall. It was hovering off the ground, about a foot off the ground the entire time that it was in sight. from their descriptions, it was more of a mechanical type thing. It was sputtering this oily substance and a kind of a stannic smell. And in fact, all of the people that were there got violently ill, and a dog that was with them apparently died shortly after the incident. This particular case was investigated by the military, so they had an interest in it. And then you also have, of course, the famous Kelly Hopkinsville Goblin case from 1955, where a family known as the Sutton family, and again in a remote area of Kentucky, claimed that they were besieged one night by these floating goblin-like creatures, silver goblin-like creatures that were popping up all over the place and grabbing at their hair. And they weren't really flying, but according to these eyewitnesses, whenever they would shoot these goblin-like creatures, it would create a metal plunking sound, and that these beings would not fall to the ground, but they would just sort of float down. So one interesting theory about the Kelly Hopkinsville's case, going back to Nick's story about the circus animals, is that they were actually escaped circus monkeys that were painted silver, which I think is even more bizarre than the notion of aliens, personally. But so, and this is a very famous case from Texas. This is known as the Houston Batman. I actually did a story for a Houston news channel around Halloween. I don't know if any of you saw that or not, but this is again a story from the 1950s in an area of Houston called the Heights. And there were 3 people that were sitting out on their patio one night, and they claimed that they saw this shadowy figure fly up into a tree, and that when they got a good look at it, it turned out to be a humanoid creature standing about 6 or 7 feet tall with bat-like wings. And what's really weird is they described it as having a uniform on, like a paratrooper, complete with knee-length boots and a helmet. And as they watched this thing, it was this being, he was kind of glowing and rocking back and forth in the tree, and then the light faded out and he vanished. And a short while later, they described a torpedo-shaped object shooting into the air at rapid speed. So as you can see, a lot of these cases from the 1950s, of course, we have to remember this is right after the famous flying saucer incident, where a pilot named Kenneth Arnold in 1947 first described these 9 disc-shaped objects skipping through the air in Washington State. And so the whole nation kind of had this was under the grip of this UFO flying saucer invasion hysteria. Now there is a gentleman in San Antonio named Frank Ramirez, and I've gotten to know Frank very well. He got in touch with me a few years ago, and essentially Frank has told me that he has seen a creature similar to the Houston Batman on the roof of his grandmother's garage, or his mother's garage. And Frank's an artist, so he actually drew this figure for me. This is kind of what he saw. He heard a disturbance out in his yard one night, and when he went outside, he saw this massive figure on the roof, and he said that it just sort of unfurled and grew, and as it got taller, it kind of had took on a humanoid shape. And he described the face as kind of being stretched out, humanoid face that was stretched out, very sinister with black sunken eyes. It's really changed his life. And it's one thing to read about eyewitness reports in a book or on the internet, but when you get to know an eyewitness and you sit down and you look them in the eye and you see how it's really traumatized them and changed their life, that becomes very convincing. I really think Frank did encounter some type of humanoid creature. I don't know exactly what it is, but he sort of views these things as omens, much like the traditional theory of the Mothman type creature. Thanks, Nick. So now let's get on to the king of all flying humanoids, the Mothman. And of course, many of you have seen the movie with Richard Gere, have read the book by John Keel, which is kind of iconic and famous in the field of Forteana. The Mothman was first encountered in November of 1966. Of course, it made international headlines. People began to describe this man-like creature with large red glowing eyes, bat-like wings that could travel at impossible speeds. It was chasing people in cars. It was shooting up in the air, straight up in the air like a helicopter. Sightings centered around a small community known as Point Pleasant, West Virginia, which is on the border with Ohio. And John Keel wrote, of course, the famous book, The Mothman Prophecies. He went to Point Pleasant and investigated many of these cases. And about a year after the first Mothman sighting, exactly 1 year and 1 month after the first Mothman sighting, the Silver Bridge, which was a major bridge over the Ohio River there, collapsed and killing 46 people. And shortly after that, sightings of the Mothman seemed to dissipate. So many people to this day in Point Pleasant feel that the Mothman was somehow connected with this horrible bridge calamity, and that's kind of the nature of the Mothman Prophecies movie as well. So here's a picture of John Keel, and what I think is probably one of the coolest book covers ever conceived here. A picture of kind of a artistic interpretation of the Mothman. I don't know if he really looked like that or not, but Keel was an interesting character. Now, we have to keep in mind that Keel was, he referred to himself as a demonologist, but he was, at the time that the Mothman stuff was happening, he was completely involved in UFO research, along with another gentleman named Gray Barker. And in Keel's mind, UFOs and spirit demon activity and even things like Bigfoot and Mothman were all related. It was all the same phenomenon, which is pretty powerful when you think about it. He felt that it was essentially, there was this cosmic joker, is what he referred to it as, trooping fairy menagerie, that essentially, for reasons beyond our comprehension, would manifest in front of human beings in different forms. And, you know, so he would often, you know, for example, many of the Mothman eyewitnesses who he got to know very well, he would actually provide them with crucifixes and tell them where to hang them in the house to ward off the demons. And he was actually very paranoid also. He felt that the CIA and the Men in Black were after him, and, you know, perhaps they were, you know, I can't say, but I have found that John Keel, although he's held in a very high regard in the field of in the Fortean field, he was also a little bit of an embellisher. And I've, you know, by checking some of his facts, I've found that he actually did take certain journalistic license with some of the reports and sightings to kind of suit his needs. So I think his book is very important, and it's kind of a must-read type of book for anyone interested in the unexplained. You know, but also keep that in mind that, you know, Keel was actually, he was a bit of a storyteller. So I mean, he was kind of, you know, and he was also kind of very wrapped up in the whole phenomenon at the time. So his perception may have been colored to some extent. Next thing. I visited Point Pleasant last year. I actually did a television show for the Canadian History Channel. It was hosted by William Shatner, and unfortunately I didn't get to meet William Shatner, which I was really hoping that I would. But you know, this is a famous statue that they have in the center of Point Pleasant. Again, a little bit of artistic interpretation there, but you know, it should be noted that Point Pleasant is actually, it's a very sleepy little town. Most of the people there don't like to talk about the Mothman, but on the other hand, it's actually been a boon to their tourist industry there. They have a museum, they have a festival, you know, so the Mothman is kind of big business in Point Pleasant. But many of the people there also view Mothman as, again, the cause of the bridge collapse, something really bad that kind of created a lot of turmoil in their community. Here I am at the Mothman Museum, kind of joking around with Lauren Coleman. He was up there doing the television show as well. Kind of a little anecdotal story about Lauren here. After we took this picture, he turned to me and asked me if I wanted to take another picture without the funny face. So Lauren's obviously a very iconic figure in the field of cryptozoology, but he's also a little bit uptight at times, and I guess I was clowning around a little bit too much for his. But anyways, he's kind of the historical expert on a lot of the Mothman cases. We were there kind of presenting two different ideologies to the television show. Lauren feels that the Mothman was simply based on misidentifications of a giant bird or a giant owl, and that the rest of it was kind of sort of embellished or, you know, sort of made up in people's minds. Whereas I was there basically coloring Mothman as something a little bit more paranormal in nature, something supernatural. I don't see how people could have simply made something like a giant bird into the Mothman. But, you know, there's different opinions and different interpretations of the phenomenon, of course. Now, moving on, we have the British version of Mothman, I guess you could call it, which is the Owlman. And Owlman is something that has been reported in a very specific area in southern England, in a place called Mownan Church, which is on the southern coast of England. Reports of the Owlman began to surface in 1976. And Owlman was described as a man-like figure, much like Mothman, the big glowing red eyes, sort of feathered or covered with a gray downy fur type of material. And interesting, Owlman was mostly reported by adolescents, mostly young women. And so, you know, not a lot of modern reports that I'm aware of. A good friend of mine and Nick's, John Downs, has written a book called The Owlman and Others, and he really does a good job of sort of addressing the entire Owlman phenomenon. But seem to be a lot of connections between the Owlman and the Mothman in terms of the descriptions and, you know, the time frames and so forth. Kind of another interesting creature that's been only reported once is known as the bat squatch. And this particular figure was reported near Mount Rainier, Washington in 1994. A young gentleman named Brian Canfield claimed he was driving his car one night on a remote mountain road. Suddenly his car died, his headlights dimmed, and this massive creature descended from the sky in front of his car. He described it as standing about 9 feet tall, having a face like a wolf, with very sharp teeth, yellow crescent-shaped eyes, and bat wings. And it essentially, according to this gentleman, it stood there in front of his car for several minutes, not really menacing or anything, just kind of standing there, and then it took off into the air. The reason it's called bat squatch, of course, is because it's very large and muscular, and it was reported in Washington State, where most people are familiar with reports of Sasquatch. So again, another one of these just weird variations of flying humanoid types of creatures. Wisconsin has a creature known as the man bat of Briggs Road. I think Nick actually investigated this for an episode of Monster Quest, didn't you? Yeah, so kind of a, again, there's a Cherokee gentleman named Wahali. He and his son were driving home one night in Wisconsin, and they claimed that this thing basically dive bombed their car, and they described it as looking like, you know, like one of the vampires out of the Van Helsing movie, you know, kind of like a man-bat type creature. They both became violently ill. This particular case was investigated by Linda Godfrey, who's written the books about the, you know, the Beast of Bray Road. I commissioned her to do this drawing for my book because since she investigated that case initially. And a little anecdotal thing here, Linda told me that she believed that she developed breast cancer when she first began investigating the case of the man bat, and that her doctor told her that it was developing at an uncanny rate. So Linda, you know, fortunately, she's in remission, but Linda at least believes that these flying humanoid creatures, again, are just very bad juju, bad karma, and that just becoming associated or affiliated with this thing caused that bad thing to happen in her life. In Mexico recently, there was a sighting of a creature similar to the Mothman. A student in Chihuahua, Mexico was driving one night, and he saw something hunched down on the side of the road, and as he came up on it, it sort of stood up, and he described it as looking like a man-like figure with 4 wings, a billowbate tail, and kind of a dome-shaped forehead. And he claims that much like the Mothman, that it actually chased his car. He sped off, and it followed along his car and was looking in the window at him, and was quite terrifying to him. So some very recent reports, in fact. And then also in Mexico, Mexico seems to be an epicenter for the flying humanoid phenomenon. We were talking about Camazotz earlier and different things like that. But we also have these different videotapes that began to surface in the year 2000. And these were shot by different UFO researchers in Mexico, and they're alleged to show basically man-like figures just floating up high in the air. Now these are not winged figures, they essentially just look like human-shaped figures, but this is the first one that was shot in February of 2000 by a man named Amado Marquez. Thanks, Nick. This one was shot by his associate in the following month, a gentleman named Salvador Guerrero, very high up in the air. This one was filmed in 2005 by a gentleman named Horatio Roquette over Mexico City. And this is, you know, kind of compelling, kind of a massive, bulky humanoid creature. It looks like it's got some kind of glowing object just underneath it there. Here's another one from 2008, I believe. So, you know, again, these are basically a new type of flying humanoid. They've been referred to by Mexican UFO researchers as UFHs, unidentified flying humanoids. And it has been speculated that these might in fact just be something like, you know, man-shaped balloons or balloon-shaped objects that people are, you know, releasing into the air, because they're only seen at very high altitudes sort of floating around. But as you know, a lot of UFO activity in Mexico over recent years. It's been kind of an epicenter or a hotspot. So for an episode of Monster Quest, I traveled down to Monterrey, Mexico to investigate some of these videos and to also interview this gentleman, Leonardo Samaniego. Leonardo is a police officer who claims that a flying witch attacked his patrol car back in 2004. And this was big news in Mexico. It made all the local newspapers. He described her as basically a hideous hag-like woman with large black eyes, and that she literally flew on top of his patrol car and was clawing at his patrol car. So we interviewed Leonardo, and I have to tell you, he's still on the police force, and he was gracious enough to reenact the incident for the Monster Quest episode. Leonardo actually was breaking down and crying throughout the course of his interview. And you know, you're talking, and this is like 5 years after the fact, so he was obviously believes that he did encounter some type of non-human entity. Go ahead, Nick. I know I got to fly through here to finish up. As part of the episode, we went out to an area known as La Huasteca, which is in the Sierra Madre Mountains south of Monterey. And in this particular area, there are many legends about Birdman type creatures or Batman type creatures. And so we climbed up one of the mountains where there was this cave system, and you can see how high we were here. This is our car. We had a team of spelunkers and mountain climbers that we assembled. And then here I am in a massive cave system. You know, please understand, when you're doing a television show, you know, there has to be some entertainment value there. So the producers thought, well, let's go look for a man-bat type creature. Why don't we go into this cave? And unfortunately, we didn't find it. And I'm going to wrap up by, you know, basically, you know, I encourage you to buy the book if you're interested in the flying humanoid phenomenon. It will be out this year. You know, there's this whole notion that, and Nick kind of touched on this, that at least some of the cases that we investigate in the field of cryptozoology are not necessarily flesh and blood animals. And for example, there's this very famous book known as The Goblin Universe, and a gentleman named Ted Holliday that began investigating the Loch Ness Monster and other things felt that a lot of these creatures that we're dealing with are actually not flesh and blood, but somehow interdimensional or supernatural in nature. And in fact, he's got a picture of a plesiosaur flying through the galaxy, which I think is kind of, and then I have to pick on Lauren a little bit more here because he's probably embarrassed. But here's a book that Lauren co-wrote in 1976, Creatures of the Outer Edge. Re-released as Creatures of the Goblin Universe, Goblin World, and it shows Bigfoot being beamed down from a flying saucer. So I don't know how he feels about it these days, but anyways, that's it. I don't know if I probably don't have time for any questions or. Okay, I'll take 2 questions, couple questions. Anybody curious about Mothman? Or
the same one here recently on all the sightings up there, or the San Juan Valley in Colorado?
No, really.
Yeah, I was reading something about it. I thought it was all right.
Well, I hadn't heard about those, but I can say that in my book, I have a lot of people got in touch with me after the Monster Quest episode, and basically, hey, I've seen one of those things. So I have a lot of unpublished reports and sightings and cases of people that have seen them. But it seems to be a global phenomenon, but hopefully no one here will see one because it seems to be kind of bad luck. Anybody else?
I have an observation.
Okay.
First of all, that's epic. It needs to be on the side of a van somewhere. And another observation is, you were talking about the Alkanost Russian mythology.
Alkanost?
Yeah, and how it has the voice or whatever.
Yeah.
I kind of liken that to the Mechuza, like.
Yeah.
And then.
That's a good point, and we talk about Lechuza. I'm sure all of you, thanks Sydney. Lechuza is, of course, a very famous legend we have here in Texas and Mexico of this flying witch, and you know, it's kind of a magical type supernatural being. So yes, I write about that as well. So, all right, well, thank you all for coming out. Thanks to Craig Woolheater and Cryptomundo for having us out here. Thanks to Steve Brucey and Museum of the Weird for hosting us.
Steve Brucey and Museum of the Weird for hosting the event. Showing the creature from Black Lake. So, you know, when we come back from break, we'll be screening that. Yeah. And everybody, hopefully everybody's coming down to join us for dinner at the corner at Chupacabra Cantina to carry on the crypto theme. They've got the back room set up for us. Ready to go.
We're bringing some chupacabras with us. Thanks, guys.